very good morning, good evening, and a good afternoon to people joining us from near and far. Welcome to the inaugural edition of USISPF's Indo-Pacific Security Dialogue. These will be monthly panel discussions, with experts from think tanks, journalists, academics, former government officials now in the private sector. And the idea is to kind of have a deep dive and discourse and discussion on, the role of the Indo-Pacific and the region and the key areas of the Quad, the convergence we're seeing between governments and business in one of the most dynamic regions of the world. And, our webinar will feature four experts from four different Quad countries, but focusing on one broad aspect, that's the Indo-Pacific. And this year is the 20th anniversary of the Quad that arose from this nebulous grouping focused on, at that time, relief work in the Indian Ocean region after the aftermath of the horrific tsunami in 2004, to now becoming one of the most robust coalitions, almost a $35 trillion set of four economies dedicated to security cooperation, multilateral diplomacy, economic relief within the Indo-Pacific region. And to unpack this dynamic region, I have a dynamic panel. So without further ado, I want to introduce three of our four guests who are on right now, starting with Justin Bussey, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Dr. Satu Limai, Vice President, East-West Center, Ken Moriyasu, the Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia, and we will be joined soon by Manjeet Kriplani, the Executive Director of Gateway House. Bear with us. Apologies, she's having some technical difficulties, but we will have her on as soon as possible. Um, Not only do we have four experts representing four different Quad countries, but we have our four panelists across the globe at the moment. As I said, it's as early as 9 a.m. for Ken in Washington, D.C., as late as 11:30 for Justin in Sydney, and 3 p.m. for Satu in Slovenia right now, who's at a conference in a very idyllic setting. So, like the Indo-Pacific, we're stretching the world clock here. So I'm going to get started with a few questions, and please feel free to chime in with your question in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the limited amount of time frame here. One caveat: this conversation is being recorded and will be available later on USISPF's YouTube platform, so you can check it out there as well. Justin, it's September, and summer turns to fall right here in the northern hemisphere. A little different where you are in the southern hemisphere. And it's India's turn to host the Quad Summit, and as it was Australia's last year, but we saw President Biden's visit to India in January that didn't fructify.
Yeah.
India was busy with elections in April to June, and the US is going to be busy with elections from now till November. And there's still talks about Prime Minister Albanese trying to come for the UNGA session right now, and if he were to come, there'd be talks about an informal Quad Summit taking place on the sidelines of UNGA, throwback to almost 2021 when we had the first in principle meeting. So, what's the likelihood of UNGA, a Quad Summit happening on the sidelines of UNGA?
Akshobh, thank you for the invite. It's great to be here with a great panel. And yes, it is late here, but the Quad is important. So it's one of the few things that would get me online at this time to have a strategic discussion. Look, actually, I think the first part is we don't know. It hasn't been announced whether Australia's Prime Minister Albanese is going to attend this year's UNGA. But I think there are two elements here. If it would be great if he did attend, and if he did attend, I would think that it would be almost guaranteed that there would be a Quad meeting in the margins. The only reason there wouldn't be is if one of the leaders was not there. And remembering that the link between the Quad and UNGA is actually quite significant, because while you said in the intro that this is 20 years after the first iteration of the Quad, of course, went into abeyance for a good decade. The very first foreign ministers Quad in 2019 was in the margins of UNGA in 2019. So the link there is important. And I think the incredible part of the Quad, Akshobh, is that it really, after being almost dead for a decade, rising again with the foreign ministers meeting in 2019, straight into a leaders meeting in 2021, it really did explode and elevate very quickly. So people have associated almost as having greater success over a longer period of time than it really has. And so there is already an expectation that the Quad stands alone and has meetings in one of the four capitals. And that's great. And where possible, I think it should always happen. But I think the Quad is so important for the four, not just for the Indo-Pacific, but the linking of all of the issues around the world. We are effectively fighting battles on three fronts, of course, in Europe, the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific. So I think the Quad is vital. And so where the four leaders or the four foreign ministers, or for that matter, four defense ministers are together in the same city at the same time, I'm of the view that there should always be a Quad meeting. And so our Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister, didn't attend the peace conference or the NATO conference earlier this year. I think it would be great if Prime Minister Albanese attended this year's UNGA, and that would enable the Quad leaders meeting to happen this year. So I don't think there's any detriment to it being in the margins of another meeting. Whenever the four leaders are together, we should hold it, is my view.
All right, perfect. And just before I get to Ken, hi Manjeet, we finally can see you now. Hallelujah. We're talking about critical emerging tech, and yet we always find the simple tech precludes us. So thank you for joining us. And so sorry that we had to, keep you in the waiting room. Zoom. We're never gonna get over tech for faux at with in the virtual world as well. I'm gonna get to you in a second, Manjeet, but I'm moving on to Ken right now. And thank you for kicking us off, Justin. Ken, as Justin touched on, about the Quad level meeting on the sidelines of Anga. It's a bit of a deja vu, right? Because the first in-person principal level Quad summit took place in 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic then. And back then, the then Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshihide Suga, was seen as sort of a lame duck given he was going to step down. So there was still this nebulousness of what would that mean for Japan going forward. And now, cut to 2024, the same is going to happen with the successor, Prime Minister Kishida, who's now going to run for a re-election and thereby step down as president of the LDP. So, from Tokyo's perspective, what's the thinking right now? Does geopolitics sort of take a back seat as Tokyo gets into the next leadership mode?
So absolutely not in terms of the last part. But I think it's really interesting to focus on the scheduling when they will hold a meeting, because the Quad has always had scheduling issues. Like you said, the first very historic Quad summit had to take place with a departing Japanese Prime Minister. And again, we're trying to hold the 20th anniversary with somebody, a Japanese leader who's on his way out. But on the flip side, there were instances like the Albanese attending the Quad summit on day 2 of his regime. But it just goes to say, I think there are 3 takeaways from the scheduling issue. One, it just shows that how important these 4 countries are. And increasingly, I think as India becomes the leader of the global South, every country in Africa will want to meet with the Prime Minister of India. So to manage the really important busy schedules of the US President and the Indian Prime Minister, as well as Japan and Australia, is going to be more and more challenging, but it just goes to show the value of these 4 leaders meeting. The second part is that all 4 of them are democratic countries, and they have to settle their domestic political situations to attend. And like Justin said, Prime Minister Albanese did not come to the NATO summit or the peace summit, I presume for domestic reasons. But for them to come to the Quad summit, overcoming any domestic challenges, just shows the value of this. And of course, the fact that Albanese can attend on day 2, or that the Japanese Prime Minister will attend this time on his way out, but probably the next Prime Minister will also value the Quad, just goes to show the resilience of this grouping, which China does not like. The difference between the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for instance, and the Quad is that one is a compilation of democratic systems, the other is a gathering of autocratic systems. So there's a difference in value in that. And the third point is that, like Justin said, whenever the four leaders are together, they should meet. I think, judging from the busy schedules, it's going to be virtually impossible to have a standalone Quad in the future. So I think they should be held on the sidelines of either the G7, the G20, the UN General Assembly, or the East Asia Summit. On the flip side, I think there should always be a Quad summit at for instance, the East Asia Summit that would pressure the US president, who always tends to not attend, to attend. There will be an incentive for that American leader to attend. Right, that's it for me.
Well, can you cue American leaders? I have to go straight to Satu. And Satu, July saw one of the craziest political months here in the history of US presidential elections. And as you said, ensconced in Europe right now, Washington has sort of made a conscientious shift, right? From once focusing on transatlantic relations to now prioritizing Indo-Pacific and the littoral states around it. I mean, we saw the Indo-Pacific take precedence even under Trump 1.0, that further fructified under President Biden. And so, irrespective of Harris or Trump presidency in Jan 2025, trying to say the Indo-Pacific will only be accentuated for the next 4 years. It's so central to U.S. national security.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Akshobh, and let me join my colleagues, first of all, in saying how delighted I am to share a panel with them and for your leadership in U.S. India Strategic Partnership Forum for holding this program. Let me make a couple of comments. The timing is important. Holding a Quad on the 20th anniversary is really, I agree with both Ken and Justin, really important. I would say structurally, what's been more important is that the Quad has gone through 4 phases, right? It arose as a result of a response to an incredible humanitarian disaster, the tsunami and all that followed. It went into repose in the next decade. It revived in the following decade. And as we look 10 years out and mark its 20th, I believe it will remain more than ever relevant. And I think the work that's been done, particularly from roughly 2017 on, will make sure that whether it's held on the sidelines of the UNGA, on the sidelines of the EAS, if it's held in one of the capitals, wherever it's held, whatever format, the utility of the arrangement will hold, and it will become more relevant. Second, to your real big question on the Indo-Pacific, here I am sitting in Slovenia and just got done participating on a panel in India in the Emerging International Order, and then an Indo-Pacific panel, where I heard a very senior former Vice Minister of Korea and Lieutenant General from Japan talk about how important peace in Europe was to the Indo-Pacific and how important NATO and EU's role is in the Indo-Pacific. So I totally appreciate the pivot or the rebalance or whatever you want to call it to the Indo-Pacific, and I concur with you, Akshobh, that there has indeed been a high focus in both administrations. I see absolutely no prospect of change given our concerns about China, our quite justifiable and justified concerns about China, that the focus and importance of the Indo-Pacific. But, and as you know, from my background as the creator and originator of the Asia Matters for America, I have been kind of singing the tune of trying to get better and more appreciation of just how important Asia is to everyday lives in America, everyday citizens, not only at high policy levels. So all of that I share. Now, I will say, having said all of that, that I have a slight concern about picking a region. We are living in an era of fragmentation. We are living in an era of multipolarity. We are living in an era of deglobalization, de-risking. You can call it whatever you want. You can ascribe whether it's 3% off on globalization, 2%, 10%, doesn't matter. But some change structurally is going on in the system. And in that system, you can't pick a region because in the Indo-Pacific is not picking its own region. It's playing a very heavy role in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The Europeans are very heavily interested in the fate of the Indo-Pacific and China. We just heard from the EU leadership this morning here that how important EU is on investment and aid programs and other engagements with. And of course, as you well know, New Zealand, we have Australia on the panel, but we have New Zealand, Australia, Japan and Korea are now IP4 members of NATO. So I want to just suggest that we live in an era where we can't pick a region, and that we have to think about the interrelationships of maintaining global values, global rules, global order, by integrating the best available tool sets and the best available options to deal with the challenges we face, whether in the economic or security realm. And I would just conclude by saying, I believe Quad to be one, not the only one of these tool sets. Alliances, partnerships, the trilateral between US, Japan, Korea, the UN, other arrangements are also going to be important. And in this context, I would simply say the Quad as a Indo-Pacific spanning toolkit or arrangement is a fundamental contribution to that arrangement and to those goals.
Thank you so much, Satu. And, welcome again to Manjit. And Manjit, I was saying we've
Thanks.
really expanded the Indo-Pacific with the Indo-Pacific time clock as 9 a.m. for Ken and 11:30 for Justin. And a very good evening to you at 6:30 p.m. in Bombay.
Thank
Um,
you.
you know, Manjit, we marked like a decade of Prime Minister Modi in power, and one of the sacrosanct elements of the Modi government's foreign policy when they came about in 2014 was this Act East policy. Particularly with ASEAN countries and Indo-Pacific countries. And for a lot of these countries back in the day, India was sort of viewed once just as a soft power, this cultural behemoth, but not so much as a strategic power. Is the elephant in the room the dragon, China? Given that that's once turned India's foreign policy evolution that was seen more as reticent, perhaps pusillanimous to a more proactive player. So, do you see China sort of has pushed India's foreign policy to be more assertive, particularly in the Quad and the Indo-Pacific region?
I would say, am I audible? Am I good? Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great,
Please go ahead.
terrific. Okay. So I would say certainly China has played a role, but also India's come into its own, Akshobh. And we have to recognize that this is the country that is always playing defensive. I mean, we're just never on the offensive, right? And so if you say we've been reticent because we haven't had an economy that allows us to be anything more. We've had to focus on our internal matters. And now that we are seeing growth again, we were 9% in 2007, and now we're seeing 8% in 2024. It's taken us a long time to get our act together. And so now we have the breadth and we have the capacity to think beyond our own world. Also, the world has changed. India reticent 30 years ago is not India reticent today. The geopolitical situation was saying, as Satu was saying, everybody is pivoting into different areas. China, of course, is very, very important. But India also realizes for the first time since Mr. Modi's come in, there's been the Act East policy has included India's Northeast. That has been critical to India's Act East policy. And we saw what happened in Bangladesh is going to cause some kind of interruption, in this extension of India into ASEAN. Although we did sign a trade agreement with ASEAN, but we've never really taken advantage of it because we're not a trading nation. Now we're trying to become a trading nation. We're seeing a lot of trade deals, particularly with our friends in the Indo-Pacific, with Australia, which has been absolutely fantastic. And so you're going to see India stepping up in the world, and everyone's threat perception has changed. So our threat perception is obviously not Ukraine, except for what it does, but it certainly is China. And it is, for the US, it is China. For Japan, it's China. For Australia, it's China. So it is, it's time. And India now, especially with its Quad partners, with the US, I mean, we've never been closer. We've signed so many agreements with the US, but we really have to accept that India is playing a strategic game. But India's strategic game is not, it's really to say that maybe our role is there to restrain China. It's a role that Singapore played some years ago, is to make sure that the UN didn't turn anti-US. But I would say, yeah, India's role is that, but we also have a larger role to play. And I'd like to correct Ken to say that we are in the SCO and we are a democracy. So there are new groupings coming out in the world. And India is playing that very critical role of being a balancer and an anchor. So we may not, our friends may not like it that we're in the SCO, but we're also the air in the SCO.
Yeah, absolutely. India's in SEO and BRICS and Quad, so that's a very interesting
Right.
part of India's foreign policy, and I'll get to that, Manjeet. And before I get to Justin, just a reminder to audience: please feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get through it as many as we can, depending on the time and once we get through the moderated discussion. Justin, as we touch on China, just walk down memory lane into Canberra's decision making, which you were a key part of for many years. Australia withdrew from the Quad from 2008 to 2012, at a time when the world was going through a recession, but China's boom was sort of central to Australia's commodity exports. And it's what Donald Horn would say, the lucky country, right? Australia avoided the cataclysmic impacts of a global downturn. And if I'm not mistaken, it was a Labour government back then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, now ambassador, a fluent Mandarin speaker, someone who understands China well. Perhaps was the concern that Canberra was a little more circumspect on coalitions that would antagonize Beijing, and Australia's economy is far too vulnerable to do that. But where is Canberra's thinking now that Australia is a far bigger, more assertive player on the Quad? What's changed in Sino-Australian ties?
Thanks, Akshobh, and it's a good question. Let me just very quickly reference something that Manjeet said about India being in the SCO, in BRICS. From my perspective, just an Australian perspective, I think there is a clear separation between India's involvement in those groupings of SCO and BRICS versus their involvement in Quad. From my perspective, I see India's involvement in SCO and BRICS as almost a monitoring that it's better for them to be in, to know what's going on, to keep an eye on other countries that they don't trust. They don't trust all of the countries in those groupings, whereas the Quad exists because there is greater trust. There is greater relevance, greater substance, and so it's a grouping of greater substance and stability for the region. In terms of what's changed, it's a very good point, and I think it isn't Quad specific. It really is what changed for Australia when Australia and the Quad went their different ways in 2007, 2008. It was, as you say, because Australia viewed its relationship with China in a way that, in hindsight, was a misjudgment. And it wasn't just in relation to getting out of the Quad. It was a mistake that not just Australia, but other countries had made in a series of decisions, whether it be wanting and desiring China to come into other international groupings like the World Trade Organization, and thinking that the institutions would change China, and then realizing after a while that no, in fact, China was changing the institutions. And so what happened after 2008, the global financial crisis, Australia thought that its economic prosperity, economic recovery was the priority. And so Australia decided to put economics over security. In part, the advice and the judgment was that in combination with China's involvement in other institutions and good faith decisions by Australia, increased trade, the absolute advocacy of the free trade agreement with China would be reciprocated. And that the interrelationship, the interdependency would result in a closer relationship, and the bad behavior, the unacceptable behavior by Beijing would decrease. But by 2015, 2016, there was a realization that putting economics at such a higher level than security wasn't resulting in reciprocal good faith behavior by Beijing. It was actually incentivizing bad behavior because Beijing felt that Australia would tolerate any behavior if the economic partnership was strong. And so by 2015, 2016, there was a confluence of events. And instead of just salami slicing us, Beijing decided to do everything at once. They were investing, they were trying to get into our critical sensitive infrastructure. They were undertaking cyber attacks. They were undertaking what we now know, didn't know at the time, but now know is foreign interference, constant cyber attacks. And so what happened was around 2016, there was a strategic shift. And it really, yes, it was Prime Minister Turnbull at the time, but I think the reason it was successful was that it wasn't a party political issue. It wasn't partisan. There was bipartisan support obviously through the Prime Minister at the time, but the opposition leader and the opposition major party, all agreed that Australia's strategic circumstances were changing. I think the phrase that Manjeet used in terms of the threat perception, it was both threat perception, threat reality changed. And so therefore, Australia had to make a decision. Were we going to allow another country agency over our own strategic and security decision making, or were we going to maintain and regain that agency? And so the word sovereignty became important, Akshobh. So in terms of the balancing of economics and security, the question became, was Australia going to put its sovereignty first? And so there was that strategic shift. And so now we have that baked in. The Quad was regenerated in 2017 at the senior officials level, 2019 at the foreign ministers level, 2021 leaders. And now it is genuinely baked in. What I would say is that while it is baked in, and that is absolutely fantastic news, I think what we all need, and this is not just an Australian issue, it's for all of the countries that the panel represents, is that the Quad, of course, does wonderfully positive capacity building, economic prosperity, critical infrastructure work. But we can't allow the Quad to become absent security. The Quad has to do all of these elements, and security has to be a part of the Quad. And so there is a risk, I think, that as we go into the next stage, the fourth phase, as Satu mentioned, of the Quad, that there is a risk that the countries go so far down, at least publicly, of the Quad not being security related, that we actually forget part of the reason why it's so important. And that's something that we all need to look to.
Yeah, thanks for that, Justin. And I that's a very interesting phase of when Australia backed out of the Quad and the resurgence of the Quad, and you've kind of explained the 2017 phase onwards. And again, that brings me to my question to you, because part of that resurgence or rejigging that Quad goes to the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, and he was integral to the revival of the Quad. Given Japan's post World War II reticence and sort of in being part of defensive pact, sort of the hesitation. Tokyo's alacrity to the Quad, does that also stem from the concerns that Tokyo's neighborhood sees, particularly with the belligerent Beijing in the East China Sea, given the disputes over the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands, and the maritime aspect of the security that's really pushed Tokyo a little more further into the Quad?
Right. On the last part, I don't think Japan needs India to defend the Senkaku Islands, for instance. I think it's more of defending a rules-based international order, big picture like that. I have here Mr. Shinzo Abe's memoir, which I think is being translated into English right now. He explains the reason why Japan, as you say, in the post-World War II era, was reluctant to take on a regional role was because during World War II, Japan advocated for a greater East Asia prosperity sphere, which was like basically Japan, the Korea, which it annexed, and Manchukuo and China and Southeast Asia, to create a sphere of influence that wouldn't be interfered by the Allies. And because of that history, there was a reluctance for Japan to take on regional roles. But Abe says that the rise of the Belt and Road initiative by China to create a sphere of influence not joined by values or a common worldview, but by interests, economic interests. This was worrying to Abe. So he took part, he launched in 2016 the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Initially, it was called the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, but the Japanese Foreign Ministry dropped the word strategy a few years later because it sounded very military and security oriented. It was more of a concept of the world which Abe and Japan wanted to see. And Abe had always talked about the importance of India. In 2006, when he was first prime minister, he wrote a book called Towards a Beautiful Country, in which he talked a lot about the importance of India and Japan and India joining hands. And the next year, in 2007, he went to India himself and gave a very famous speech called The Confidence of the Two Seas, where he talked about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean uniting to create a sphere of freedom. And that really came back in 2016 after he saw the Belt and Road Initiative to unite the Quad countries to defend the international order.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and hopefully to get that memoir in English will be worth a read. Satu, Justin touched on something very interesting about Quad and the security aspects, and I encourage everyone to read the wonderful report that the East-West Center and Observer Research Foundation put out on 2 decades of the Quad. It was really a very comprehensive read. I couldn't stop reading it. The focus for the Quad is always the alibi is like we're not in Asian NATO. It's focused on vaccines and health and clean energy and critical emerging technologies. But yet, as we've seen, there's a securitization aspect of the Quad coming up. While there's no standalone Quad defense ministers, as your report notes, even the working groups on cyber and space and critical emerging tech has the elements of security. So is it a fair assessment to say that while the Quad publicly may say it's not about security, security is always going to be part of the Quad?
Well, thank you for that, Akshobh. I'd like to pick up, if I could, because it leads to the security answer somewhat, is picking up on this thread on China and what Justin and both Ken talked about, and I'm sure Manjit will mention. China has been, of the 5 variables that have shaped the different phases that I've described, the rose, the repose, the revived, and the relevant of the Quad. Remember, I know it sounds like ancient history, but Australia, Japan, the United States, and India have only come to recent alignment, more or less, on China. It did not exist in the previous phases for different reasons. You'll recall that after 2001 and the 9/11 terror attacks, global war on terrorism, Operation Enduring Freedom, China got knocked off the table. Already strategic distrust was beginning, but it was knocked off the table. The 2008, 2006, 8-10 financial crisis, I remember very well. My wonderful partners and interlocutors, colleagues and friends in Australia would say, mystified that they would, Australians, for the first time in their history, were facing a trade partner which was not their main security partner. And I said, join the club, because that sounds like America. Our main trade partner is not our main security partner either anymore. You'll recall that Ken just mentioned that Japan had a free and open Indo-Pacific, and Gaimosho lopped off strategy because during the 2008 to 2016 Obama administration, there was clearly growing concern about China. But as you'll remember, there were talk of G2 at one point. So we've not been entirely in alignment. We must remember this, only a decade-old history, but it seems now in foreign policy terms, ancient history. We might as well dig into the archaeological sites to remember that we were not aligned on China. And a series of, in my Satu private views, believe that China's aggression, assertiveness, whether on the land borders with India, in the South China Sea, in the Senkakus and the East China Sea, vis-a-vis Australia and its behavior towards Australia, has turned both public and governmental policy minds around. And without this context, you can't discuss the security nature and the security context of the Quad. So that's point 1. Point 2 is that the Quad emphasizes public goods, and rightly so. Remember that public goods started in the first phase as an exceptional response to an unpremeditated need, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief under this tsunami and earthquake conditions. It became non-active in the repose phase. It became a very active expanded public goods agenda, and Justin knows this because I said it at Ricina where he was, and I'll say it again. I am always on the lookout for overly excessive diffusion of the agenda, too many items, too many unfilled promises. Public goods work best when they're focused and delivered. And so I think that's an important element of it. And even if we pick fewer, but deliver them well and often and to many, that's a great day for the Quad. It's a great day for democracy, and it's a great day for allies and partners. And I would really highly counsel, instead of spreading to more and more things, doing the things we said we do in our work. Which leads me to Quad. And my only thing is really a nuance on Justin's great point about securitization is I am cautious about overly and prematurely securitizing Quad. Inherent is Quad is security. You will recall that the response to the tsunami was not premeditated, but required our national security establishments and our defense equipment and capabilities. By definition and by history and by empirical materialism, the Quad has been from the beginning able to leverage security tools, security capabilities, and capacities. The maritime domain awareness elements of it also include this element. It's not, hard security, but it certainly is an element of maritime security. So there are security elements thrown into the Quad as part of its agenda. But again, I would just simply say that rather than excessively diffusing either the public goods agenda or the security agenda, we proceed with care, with calibration, and that we align that so that we don't get into a situation where the four parties and the region are unaligned with each other and amongst themselves.
Thanks so much, Satu. And just on the defense element, Manjit, I want to come to you next. Rajnath Singh, India's defense minister, just finished a successful visit to Washington, D.C., the first minister from Modi's 3.0 cabinet to visit, and he met with Secretary Austin, his counterpart, the NSA Jake Sullivan, and obviously the signing of the SOSA, the Security of Supplies Arrangement, which sort of bolsters defense and supply chain cooperation between the U.S. and India. You've got high-level U.S. India defense coming up. You've got INDUS-X, and this further strengthens the ISET framework. Do you see the Quad framework, as we've seen with other countries, enhancing New Delhi's ability to conduct more bilateral engagements under a larger framework? We've seen the trade agreement with Australia. We're increasing more about defense deals with the United States, despite not being a traditional treaty ally with the U.S.
So, Akshobh, right away, I'd say that India's concept is slightly different. The Quad is India and then 3 US allies, right? It's US, Japan, Australia. We don't have that concept of allies and alliances. We have our own engagements that come out of our own history, just like the idea of the alliances comes out of the history of the US and Japan and Australia. On Rajnath Singh's visit, therefore, as I mentioned, the US is our closest now defense partner. We've signed so many agreements, and that has become ever closer. We also are interested in things that other countries are not, which is co-production, co-design of defense. All this is starting to happen. And this may not be as important to other allies of the US, for instance, like the Philippines. But certainly, Australia may want to rely on the US on everything, but we are not in that phase. So the US is our closest partner in defense right now, but we do have a different engagement, right? And on China, I'd like to say that out of all our Quad partners, maybe Japan is the closest to us, but China is literally on our borders. It is physically on our border, and we've had 21 border talks. And things seem to be easing up, but it has taken us 4 years in which we didn't go to war, and we did manage through the diplomatic route to talk things out. The only thing we did was there was an act of asymmetric warfare where we banned TikTok and other Chinese apps, right, that really hurt them, especially in the technology world and with markets. We are slowly maybe going to start letting Chinese companies in, But India really has its own commitments to its economic growth. For instance, we cannot really progress with the term Atmanirbhar, independent India, if we don't continue to import some of the Chinese APIs, just like the US, right? So in that way, we are similar to the US, but our engagement with the US is complete. It is even though we have differences in the way we think about things, we're not an ally, we really are the closest partner. And I think this is going to continue.
Thanks so much for that, Manjeet. And I want to speak about another part of the world that we perhaps does not get the kind of attention it should. And Justin and Satu, I know you focus a lot on this part of the world. The Pacific Islands. And the Pacific Islands Forum, which Australia is a member. Justin, the Quad seeks to support the regional leadership of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and both India and Australia are members. I want to talk about the geostrategic competition between Australia and China in the Pacific Islands, because apart from the geostrategic location of the place, Canberra has traditionally been the dominant partner as with the democracy, key partner to Pacific nations. But Beijing's playbook has been loans, aids, and investments. So, what's the larger perspective right now between Canberra and Beijing, vying for sort of influence in that part of the world?
Yeah, another excellent question, Akshobh, and you're right. The strategic competition that we have at the moment, I think we tend to too often make the mistake that we only see it in terms of US and China. And we allow ourselves to talk about great power competition as though the rest of us are just watching on. But the Pacific is an example where there is a clear aim for Beijing to increase its influence, as you say, through increasing its presence, not just through the economy. They would have an objective of increasing their military and police presence in the region. And so it would be a most significant threat to countries in the region if China was able to successfully establish a permanent presence of its military in the region. And so we need to ensure that Australia individually, but Australia with other countries, bilaterally with Japan, with the Quad, with New Zealand, who has, even though New Zealand's a small country, a very important role in the Pacific. And of course, not forgetting the role of the French. There are many countries that have a role in the Pacific, and it's not to keep China out of the Pacific, but to ensure that any undue influence, covert influence, military presence is not established. And I think part of the issue that we grapple with is that the region here, unlike one of the differences, there are many similarities, many differences, of course, but one of the differences between the Indo-Pacific and specifically the Pacific versus Europe is that the countries in this region really do not want to talk about strategic competition. They don't want to talk about conflict. They don't want to talk about tension. Completely different to Europe, so used to talking about hybrid threats, hybrid warfare, and talking about Russia in a way that the region here simply doesn't want to talk about that way. And China, Beijing, takes advantage of that. They know that the countries in this region, other than Australia and Japan, more recently South Korea, do not really want to talk about tensions in any particular way. And so China uses coercive tactics involving, yes, financial aid, but Australia continues to be by far and away the highest provider of aid. But it's how China goes about it. And then they coerce. So you mentioned the Pacific Island Forums. We've just had the leaders meeting recently. And we've had a clear example where Taiwan is a development partner of the PIF. And that is a fact. It's accurate and was going to be referenced in the communique, the PIF communique. And China didn't like it. And so coerced the PIF to prevent it from the simple acknowledgement of Taiwan's status as a development partner. And the PIF, no doubt, decided that it just wasn't worth the battle. The problem is that it sets a precedent where China says, well, if we shout enough, if we are loud enough, if we coerce, we'll get what we want. And so that's what we need to ensure, that countries like Australia, the Quad, with countries like New Zealand, need to ensure that we are giving confidence to the Pacific Islands, that they do have their own sovereignty and their own agency. That part of the problem, to extend it slightly beyond the Pacific, Akshobh, is that we aren't consistent ourselves. We have at the moment in the South China Sea, China, of course, acting extremely aggressively against the Philippines. And from time to time, we see some excellent remarks from the US, Australia, Japan. That's great. But we've just last week seen China breach not just a disputed island, space over a territorial over a disputed island, but we've seen China breach Japan's territorial airspace. And Japan, of course, has called it unacceptable. But how many of the rest of the Quad, how many of the rest of the region came out and said that was unacceptable, joined with Japan in saying it's unacceptable? So if we're not willing to stand up as regional powers like Australia and other countries are, how do we expect small Pacific islands to do so? We have to be able to show them that we have a collective power, and not to poke China in the eye, not to simply be anti-China. It's simply to be principled and to say, if there are any breaches of international rules, we're going to come together and call it out. And that's vital in the Pacific, vital in the broader region. And consistency is where we let ourselves down. And I think the Quad and other groupings really can do better in this regard. We can be country agnostic, be principles based, and call out these breaches, and that will have a really serious impact on the competition that we have in the region.
Thanks so much, Justin. And speaking of the region, I want to go to Satu next, because Satu, a lot of your focus is on that part of the world, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Quad's a lot about strengthening relationship with countries, ASEAN countries, very central to the Indo-Pacific. And a lot of ASEAN, Satu, has been about ASEAN centrality, but we've seen with belligerence, bellicosity in the South China Sea, countries like Vietnam and Philippines have directly been in the crosshairs with China. You have countries like Singapore that sort of walk a tightrope given cultural links with China and a very strong economic and security link with the United States. And there are smaller countries, less affluent countries in ASEAN like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia that depend on Chinese investment. So is ASEAN centrality being tested by Beijing?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And as it relates to the Quad, I would say that the following, first, as you know, ASEAN has an Indo-Pacific outlook. It's not a strategy. And if you read that document carefully, as you could imagine, 10 countries with different interests, different backgrounds, different trajectories, etc., you'll find a consensus document that essentially privileges, as you say, ASEAN centrality and ASEAN-led organizations. That's hardly surprising given that it's ASEAN and the 10 member countries. So that stands to reason. I would note that there's not very keen on such elements such as Quad and any other example of, if you will, multilateral innovation in the region that is not ASEAN related. We found this out some years ago when then Prime Minister Rudd proposed the Asia-Pacific Community. I think Mr. Abe had a run at another element on an East Asia grouping. There have been different attempts to try to cobble together different arrangements that various countries thought would be useful, and none of them have been particularly attractive to ASEAN. But, we're in a different environment now. There is a proliferation of what might be called coalitional plurilateralism. You might call it a la carte multilateralism. You might call it values-based multilateralism. I mean, you could pick your term, depending on which paper I'm writing or which speech I'm giving. I'll sort of think which makes most sense in the context. But the two essences are clear. There's lots of choice to join different arrangements. There is a proliferation of such arrangements. And ASEAN is going to be in an environment where there are things like AUKUS, like Quad, like the Squad, like the trilateral Indo-Pacific, trilateral U.S.-Japan-Korea arrangement. Before there was, Justin will remember Bill Tao and many of my Australian colleagues and I writing books. Oh gosh, I don't know, maybe it was 15 years ago, a book called the Trilateral Security Dialogues, when the U.S., Japan, and Australia was a big deal. And so we've evolved. So what does that mean? So the answer to your question is ASEAN centrality is noted in every Quad statement, and I think all countries and governments truly do believe that there is a utility. All four of these governments believe there is utility in ASEAN centrality. But ASEAN centrality need not be exclusive. Just as the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlooks argues for an inclusive Indo-Pacific, that inclusivity must include different multilateral arrangements. You can't have inclusivity on one hand and not inclusivity on multilateralism. So that's point one. The final point I'd make is, quite frankly, I can think of many things to take Beijing to task for, as I have said: assertiveness, aggressiveness vis-a-vis Australia, India, Japan, ASEAN countries that have been outlined here. But I will tell you, I don't think the fundamental flaw of ASEAN, and the question is Beijing, which is testing ASEAN. It's ASEAN that's testing ASEAN. It's the Southeast Asian member states that have to decide how to use their organizational arrangement and their aspirational goal of a political security, cultural, and economic community as an arrangement that they have evolved, that they have brought to light in an environment where things are, as I said, more fragmented, more multipolar, and a combination of deglobalization, de-risking, decoupling, again, however you want to phrase it. So to me, the tests are the international evolution, and the test is within the consensus of the South 10 member countries. And you can see bits and pieces of this, attempts to sort of innovate, ASEAN -1, ASEAN plus elements. But the ASEAN project isn't going to go away. We should have no illusions. And I think I'm speaking only here as an American, I think ASEAN serves U.S. interests in many ways, whether it be commercial or security or diplomatic. And we ought to continue to support it, but not exclusively. And we must combine it with other new arrangements that make sense given the requirements of the day and age. Thank you.
Thanks. And I want to get Ken and Manjeet's perspective. I know we may go a little over time, but I'm going to use the leverage of, like, we started 5 minutes a little later, so I'm going to get Ken and Manjeet's view on this. Ken, President Biden rolled out the red carpet for Prime Minister Kishida earlier this year. Wonderful state visit. We saw the trilateral U.S., Japan, and Philippines follow that. And the term Squad got more relevance. They'd met earlier in June 2023 in Shangri-La in Singapore. How is the Squad different from the Quad? Is the S for security more, or is there more weightage given to Manila over because of its coercions and with Beijing facing Beijing's wrath in the South China Sea, or is it sort of signaling something to New Delhi?
Right. So I'm really enjoying this conversation, by the way. So 2 parts to my answer. First, let's focus on the Kishida state visit in April. He gave a speech to Congress where he said that Japan is now a global partner for the U.S. The U.S. doesn't have to burden the task of maintaining the international order by itself. Japan and Australia and South Korea, we are all with you. So this was greeted very well among lawmakers. But on the flip side, it shows that Japan has no illusions about the future of America politics. There is definitely a thread of isolationism that could surface any moment. So Japan is trying to convince lawmakers that America has to be America, and Japan is ready to support it. So this leads to the Quad Squad discussion. I think the Quad and Squad have squad is US, Japan, Australia, Philippines. I think the Quad has a more strategic role, and the squad is more tactical. The squad is about what to do, like joint drills, what to do in a Taiwan contingency, how can Philippines offer its bases, how can Japan work, how can Australia help. So if you really focus on the Taiwan Strait and the conflict that could emerge there, naturally the squad seems more important and more useful. But I think the Quad, like we said in the opening, is a combination of bigger countries. That's why it's more difficult to convene. But there is a role for those leaders, and that is to defend the RBIO, which is the rules-based international order, which is mocked a lot. But I think it's important for these four leaders to always show the world what the future world ideally should stand for. And I think the four countries have their own roles in expanding this coalition, especially India has a role in convincing as many global South countries that a free and open Indo-Pacific and a rules-based order is for the benefit rather than interest-based autocratic alliances.
Thanks, Ken. And Manjeet, just your perspective on the squad, because it's Quad minus New Delhi plus Philippines. So how is New Delhi looking at this? Does it feel sort of left out, or does it think that no, we got the Indian Ocean, the squad is for more of Pacific Ocean thing along with AUKUS? Is that sort of how New Delhi sees the squad?
Well, you said three things that matter. One is the Indian Ocean, so I'm just going to bring that up, is that really the Indo-Pacific is really been so much of the focus is on the Pacific and less on the Indo. And the Quad, Japan, Australia, the US also focus on the Pacific. So it's kind of left to us to focus on the Indo side. And the IMEC, which was announced after G20, I think is some ways in getting the attention to the Indo side. Now, on worrying about the Quad, we're not at all worried about Quad. There's absolutely no problem. We're exporting missiles to the Philippines and Vietnam. We have 2+2 with Japan coming up. All of us are interested in keeping the sea lanes open for trade. And the Quad is kind of we're one of the initiators of the Quad. It's a very important grouping for us. India has just started to create institutions where the Quad was the first. We've got BRICS. Well, BRICS was first, then came Quad, and now IMEC. This is the first time we're actually out there being ground level members and creators of new institutions. So, having the Quad and other members of the Quad become the squad and do security, that's fine. But we'd also like them to pay some attention on the Indo side. And, not everyone has to have identical mandates. It's perfectly all right. And as Sathu said, the Quad came after the tsunami. It was really a humanitarian effort. And we already have the security elements in it. So we have no problem. Just bring them on.
No, thank you so much for that, Manjeet. And I think as Ken said, I was really enjoying the conversation. I am really enjoying this conversation. I'd love to go on, but I know we've already crossed the hour mark, and unfortunately, we couldn't get to all the questions that's coming in. And and we've crossed over the days for you, Justin. It's already past the next day in Australia. So thank you for doing that. And Satu, I don't want to keep you away from your dinner this evening, and for Manjeet as well, and for Ken's day. Honestly, this conversation is being recorded because I think this pearls of wisdom that we got from four people will be later on the YouTube channel. So please do check it out. And I think we successfully did what world leaders couldn't do, that is schedule a quad level discussion. So I'm very proud of the four of us and your teams. And thank you to everyone joining. Justin, Satu, Ken, and Manjeet. The pleasure has been all mine. Thank you so much for having this conversation. And you know what? We have to do this again sometime. So we'll get back on the scheduling calendars soon. But good night to you, Justin. Good evening to Manjeet. Good afternoon, Satu, and good day to you, Ken. Thank you guys so much.